I'm now joined by Kent Rominger, a former NASA astronaut who joined NASA, I believe, in the early 1990s. He was born in Del Norte, a little bit north of, or a little bit south, I should say, of Alamosa. Graduated from CSU, and he was a Top Gun pilot who flew F-14 Tomcats off the deck of the USS Kitty Hawk. And Kent, thanks for being with us. You know, we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin's first steps on the moon. And I remember where I was. I think everybody remembers where they were if they're old enough. So where were you? I know we're about the same age. Where were you, and what do you remember about July 20th, 1969?
Oh, I remember being so excited. And I was in Del Norte, Colorado, in the living room of my parents' house, watching it on a black and white TV, and it was fuzzy. But it was just a very amazing and inspirational moment for me, where I was having a hard time believing that we as humans were actually walking on the moon.
You know, I remember watching it as a teenager, and speaking to all my friends back then, we all thought, well, for sure, we're going to be on Mars, without a doubt, by the year 2000. What happened? Where did you go off course?
You know, what happened was we won. We won that space race, right? And there was never, I don't think there was ever a big exploration plan. The plan was to beat the Soviets to the moon. It was to demonstrate that technologically we were advanced. And, you know, and until that moment, we were not ahead in that race. There was not a single milestone, I don't believe, that the Soviets didn't accomplish first before that actual moon landing. So, you know, it kind of is indicative of the spirit of, hey, persevere, stay in the race, never give up, continue to go. And finally, right, because the Soviets had the first satellite in space, they had the first human in space, they had the first woman astronaut in space, they were the first ones to orbit. Anyway, all those milestones, they were ahead in, but, you know, we persevered, we stuck with it, we had a really good plan and came through. Having said that, you know, then we didn't know what to do as a nation because we won that race. We had met our goal of demonstrating to the world, hey, we could be the first ones to the moon.
Well, of course, in the early 60s, John Kennedy made a challenge. He said, we will put a man on the moon and return him safely by the end of the decade. Yeah, he said decade. He didn't say decade. So we had a clear goal, is what you're saying right now, that we need a clear goal, more of a commitment to go to Mars?
Yes. And so, and you know, we've had several of our presidents have said, hey, we're going to Mars, right? And they've also said we're going to moon. We actually did, under the last administration, have a plan, and we being NASA, had a plan to go to Mars. It's hard to go to Mars, but we have the technology. When you change administrations, they refocus, and now we're focused back on the moon. But the moon is actually a decent stepping stone for then going on to Mars, but it delays it because it takes money to go to the moon and time. And so I think, you know, putting humans on the planet Mars probably got delayed a decade once we focused on the moon.
Well, I want to talk more about Mars, but let's put that on the table for a second. We'll get back to that. I want to talk more about you growing up in Colorado and the first inklings that you wanted to be an astronaut. Did you have any astronaut heroes growing up?
So, you know, I loved seeing Neil Armstrong walk on the moon. Alan Shepard was the first human, the first American to fly in space. He was always kind of a hero of mine. John Glenn, you know, I love following his career. And I actually wanted to be a pilot. When I was 5 years old, my father took me flying. I loved it, and I wanted to be a pilot. So I joined the Navy to be a pilot, and that's when I set my goal on becoming an astronaut. Once I figured out that if I could become a test pilot, then I would have the credentials to at least apply to NASA.
And when did you get drafted by NASA? I know the first class, John Glenn, Scott Carpenter, Alan Shepard, those heroes. I think that was 1959. It might have been the early 60s was the first class. When did you actually get, I know you're much younger than that, when did you get drafted?
Yeah, so in 1992, I went in as the 14th class of astronauts, and we had 19 Americans and 5 international candidates.
1992?
Yes.
What about growing up in Colorado? Was there anything that made it easier or more difficult to become an astronaut because you were from Colorado?
You know, as a kid, growing up in the rural part of Colorado, I kind of felt deprived that I didn't have a lot of things that other kids had in the cities. And I realized that, in fact, that was such an opportunity for me because I spent a lot of time in the mountains, hunting, fishing, dirt biking, anything with a motor and acceleration I loved. I later got into hang gliding. And Colorado lent itself to all of that for the exploration. As a younger kid, you know, me and my buddy, we would just take off on our dirt bikes before we were old enough to be on the highway, and we could wind up in New Mexico. We could wind up in old mine shafts. I purchased a rope and figured out how to rappel. Anyway, the state of Colorado turned out to be a phenomenal area for me to learn kind of expeditionary skills. And with me and a friend just kind of figuring things out on our own a lot of times.
Okay, so that makes a lot of sense. Colorado is a great place to explore, and ultimately you went on to do a lot of exploring in outer space, setting records, as a matter of fact.
So yes, I think that's a fair analogy.
Okay, so in 1992 you're drafted, and then you went on to have 5 shuttle flights altogether. Your first 2 were on board the Space Shuttle Columbia. Tell me about your first 2 flights.
Yeah, so, you know, my very first flight on Columbia, we had a space laboratory in the payload bay, which gave us way more volume than you would normally have just flying the space shuttle, because the volume where that you are able to go and float around in a shirt sleeve and pants is pretty small. So with this laboratory, we were doing science around the clock. So there were 7 of us. We split up into 2 shifts, and we would overlap, but it was really a great mission and it was a longer mission to be able to participate in science, so combustion science, protein crystal growth, and we're really trying to identify vaccines, cures for some of the diseases like AIDS and diabetes that are out there. But as a pilot, I was also kind of in charge of taking care of the space shuttle. My next flight on Columbia was very different. We took up 2 satellites, deployed them both, and basically flew in formation, there's 3 of us, and at the end of that mission, rendezvoused with them, grappled them, and then brought them back to Earth. And one of them was a telescope that looked out into the heavens. The other one was making microchips in the, in a vacuum, in the vacuum of space, where you don't have sedimentation that you do here on Earth. So it was a really fun flight for a pilot as well, because now we got to deploy and retrieve satellites.
So your first 2 shuttle flights were on board Columbia. Let's fast forward about 10 years or so to February 1st, 2003. That date sticks out in my mind because I've been a newsman all my life, and I'm sure it sticks out in your mind because that was the date that the Space Shuttle Columbia disintegrated upon re-entry over Texas. Where were you at the time that you heard about it, and what was going through your head?
Yeah, so that was February 1st, and I was the chief of the astronaut office, and that was the first space shuttle crew that I launched as the chief. And part of my duties are, when they come back in, I am airborne in our shuttle training aircraft, evaluating the weather, and I give a go for them to be deorbited. So I was at the Kennedy Space Center waiting for them to come to rendezvous on them, and then basically fly formation down the final approach path and gather wind data in that shuttle training aircraft. So, you know, real time, it became evident when we lost contact with them. And at the timing they were supposed to be showing up at the field, they didn't. I knew,
Mm-hmm.
But so I guess if they're playing touchdown time, within 30 seconds of that, I knew it was not a good day.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's where, you really learn, and we figured out, hey, we could never let that happen again. And so went back and regrouped and figured out the plan forward, which I'm very proud to have been a part of that plan forward.
And essentially, as I remember, that put everything on hold for NASA for at least a year, maybe 2 years or more.
Correct. Right. We needed to fix basically the liquid fuel tank has insulation on it, and part of that insulation came off and broke the leading edge of the wing, which we didn't know that it was broken. But with a crack, then it won't make it back to the atmosphere without basically being cut off like a blowtorch. So, yes, we had to make some fixes, and then also give ourselves ways to, know. The most important thing was to know that we had a problem. And then second of all, be able to repair it.
Mm-hmm.
With Space Station Airborne at that time, we actually didn't have to repair it as much as we could. We had a safe haven at least, where even if we lost the Space Shuttle, we could retrieve the crew.
And as I remember the liftoff, there was some question shortly thereafter that maybe some of these tiles had been damaged, or too many tiles had been damaged, and that could cause some sort of a problem upon reentry. So during the entire course of the mission, several days, there was always the question back in the back of my mind, and maybe in the back of a lot of Americans' minds, that is there something wrong that when they come back, is that going to lead to disaster? And obviously it did.
So, yes. I really, the experts real time came back and said, hey, yeah, we know this foam hit the leading edge of the wing, but it's fine. Right? We may have to do a little bit more work once Columbia is back on the ground to repair it for the next flight. Pretty much every time the Space Shuttle flew, we had tiles that were damaged that we had to repair from this phenomena. And so this was a bigger piece of foam, but, once the analysts came back and said, hey, no, shuttle's fine, it's not a safety problem. We all obviously were in the mindset to say, okay, certainly I was. And after that was one of the things where we realized, no, hey, we need to be more questioning than we have been in the past.
Okay, so we fast forwarded 10 years, but let's go back to your last couple of flights. Two of them were on Discovery. Your final flight was on Endeavour. As I understand it, your last flight on Discovery and your flight on Endeavour were to the International Space Station. And I think the first one on Discovery was the first time that a shuttle had docked with the International Space Station. Is that correct?
It was in 1999, yes. So interestingly, we were the second shuttle to the International Space Station, but the first one didn't dock because the station was so small. They went up and grappled it with their arm and then mated that piece to a piece in their payload bay and then undocked with it. And then my crew went up and we were the first ones to dock. And so it was actually really exciting. I was nervous that something wouldn't work right, but everything worked well. And we docked. So it was really rewarding for me to be a part of assembling the International Space Station.
So were you, I'm just a layperson here, so were you the first crew that actually went inside the International Space Station? You were the first ones to dock.
So no, we were the second crew to go inside of it. But the first one to actually, for me as a commander, and the commander either does the flying or lets the pilot do the flying, but it's kind of the one in charge. So it was rewarding for me to be able to get the controls for the first docking of a shuttle to the space station.
What were your impressions of the space station?
Oh, very impressive. And At that point, it was small. When I went back in 2001, it was bigger as it assembled, and it's a very impressive laboratory and home that's in orbit as we speak. So, and the second time I went back, there were people on board. So it was really neat. Susan Helms, who lives in Colorado, was one of the astronauts on board. Jim Boss, actually, Jim lives in Colorado as well. Both of them were on board the space station when I went up in 2001. And getting to see a couple of your compadres that you haven't been around for 2 months because they've been off the planet was a really, really fun experience.
So from what I understand, you do hold the record for the longest amount of time spent orbiting the Earth in a space shuttle. 5 flights altogether, something like 1,610 hours. That's just short of 10 weeks. So how many millions of miles did you fly, and how many orbits did you make?
So I think it was around 27 million miles, and I'm not sure the orbits, but the orbit is almost exactly 90 minutes, so I could do the math. But it was a lot. And in a 24-hour period, the sun either rises or sets 16 times. Every 45 minutes, you get to see an event with the sun. And so it's really, you get to see a lot of gorgeous sunrises and sunsets when you're orbiting the Earth.
I guess words cannot describe.
That's actually true. It is really a beautiful sight. Looking back at our Earth is also a very beautiful sight.
I've always played around with this thought. What would be the worst thing about being an astronaut? Seems to me it would be the privacy. I think about Apollo, 3 people on board, very tight quarters for several days. Gemini, 2 people on board, one ship. Then there was Mercury, only 1 person. I guess you get a lot of privacy there. But also the shuttle and the International Space Station. I think privacy would be the one thing that might be a real headache. Is that the biggest headache for you as far as being an astronaut was concerned, or is there something else that's even a bigger headache?
Yeah, so on the space shuttle, privacy was not a problem at all. It's like going on a camping trip and you're in a tent with your closest friends. But when you need to use the restroom, you do have a private little restroom that you can go into. For when we had on my first flight 2 crews working around the clock, we had sleep stations. So you can close them off and be isolated from the light, the noise, and everything else. And on Space Station, too, they have sleeping compartments. So you can, and station is so big now, particularly if you only have 3 astronauts on it, there's plenty of privacy up there for you. Apollo, it probably was the lack of privacy. That's probably was the most stressing of the space flights, if you think about it. Maybe Gemini. But on the shuttle, it wasn't. And they're short duration. The longest space shuttle flight was just shy of 18 days. So for 18 days, with everything else going on, it's just not a big deal.
You've also been inducted into the U.S. Astronaut Hall of Fame. You're a member of Space Explorers and something called the Mars Generation. I want to talk more about Mars as we wrap up this interview here, but what exactly is the Mars Generation?
So it's formed about a young lady, astronaut Abby, that just decided, hey, I want to be an astronaut. And I think she was 13 or 14 when she started this. She leveraged social media, garnered a big following. Since then, she's gone to college at Wellesley. But it's really an organization to bring awareness to space travel, and Mars. And so it's really neat to see this one young individual who just decided she was going to take this on. And my hat's off to Abigail. She's done a great job.
Well, speaking of Mars, let me wrap it up here. What do you think about the future of space exploration? When do you think we will finally land a person on Mars?
And so, gosh, right now it's really exciting. The focus on the moon is exciting. And by the way, I would love to go to the moon, and from personal effects, on the moon, you weigh half as much as you do on Mars. You only weigh a sixth on the moon, so I figured I could jump a lot higher and do more acrobatics on the moon. So in the moon, it's exciting because we've got goals, right? And Vice President Pence gave us goals to have a human on the moon within 5 years. So that, to me, is a really neat goal. And then Mars, I think the late 2030s are when we will be on Mars, and that's going to be a real adventure too. And it's with kind of the normal space propulsion we have right now, it's an 8 to 9 month trip to get there. You'll stay there about that much time for literally the planets to align to come home. So it's a 2-year trip. So that will be a really neat experience when we put humans on Mars.
Are you still active with NASA?
So I do things with NASA, but I work for Northrop Grumman. So I'm very active in the aerospace world and do things with NASA. From that viewpoint, I'm not actively with NASA anymore, though.
And just one final question. What would you say to a young person like Abigail who wants to become an astronaut? How would you advise him or her to go about doing that? I see Scott Carpenter, yourself, Jack Swigert have all gotten degrees in aeronautical engineering. Is that kind of a requirement, or what path should young people take if they want to become an astronaut?
So they need to follow their passion. If they want to be an astronaut, say, go for it. What interests you? As long as it involves math and science, any degree is fine for NASA. It's interesting, there are a lot of us that majored in engineering, but engineering, anything with math and science. So if you want to be a doctor, if you like biology, if you like chemistry, whatever it is you like, pursue that, but never give up. Persevere. There were times where I thought, hey, this is going to be tough, but always hung in there, and you can do it. Right? It's just, hey, follow that passion and persevere.
All right, Ken Rominger, 5 times on board the Space Shuttle. He holds the record for the longest time spent orbiting Earth on the Space Shuttle. Born in Colorado, Del Norte, an American hero. Thanks for being with us today.
Hey, my pleasure, Bill. You have a great day.